Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Chris Sweeney. Chris is an award-winning journalist, editor, and college instructor. He's here today to inform us about the fascinating book he's written entitled The Feather Detective: Mystery, Mayhem, and the Magnificent Life of Roxie Laybourne. As we'll soon hear, Roxie Laybourne became the world's first forensic ornithologist, using tiny feather fragments to solve aviation disasters, criminal cases, and even wildlife crimes. During the program, we finding out why and how the book came about, and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the remarkable talents of Miss Laybourne, and how thanks to her groundbreaking efforts, forensic ornithology is used around the world in aviation, law enforcement, wildlife conservation, and academic research. Let's start by meeting Chris and then hearing all about the feather detective. Welcome. I'm so delighted to be able to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled.
First of all, congratulations on the upcoming release of the book. I have to say, I was completely enthralled when I first read the excerpt in the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago. Eager to hear much more and have you inform viewers, Chris. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if you'd share briefly a little bit more about your background, perhaps writing, professional interests.
Sure, yeah, that sounds good. So I have been a journalist for many years. I worked for an alt weekly Village Voice newspaper down in Miami for a while, and I previously was an editor and staff writer at Boston Magazine. I have freelanced for a number of magazines over many years at this point, covering everything from the cutthroat world of competitive bagpiping to families struggling with ultra rare diseases to wildlife. And I really love writing about the intersection of wildlife and society. I often look for stories that have an animal or wildlife element to them, but not just, writing about tigers or something like that. I really want to understand how our actions and the development of our societies affects wildlife and vice versa.
Mhm. Help provide some context and background. Would you please start by sharing a little bit about Roxy's background and then what first drew you to write a story about her?
Yeah, so I'll start with my background a little bit here because I write for Audubon magazine a lot, or not a lot, but frequently. And in 2016, Audubon sent me out to Ashland, Oregon to report on the Fish and Wildlife's National Forensics Laboratory. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has this incredible facility in Ashland, Oregon that does all types of wildlife forensics. And just like any other forensics laboratory, they have people that specialize in genetics, people that specialize in ballistics, and a little bit distinct to wildlife crimes is they have people that are morphologists or really study the structure, the bones, the musculature, all these different components that distinguish animals. And while I was visiting and I was writing about the forensic ornithologist who, at the time, he's since retired, but his name was Pepper Trail. And Pepper was a brilliant guy, very just knowledgeable, obviously, had worked all types of wildlife cases involving birds. And while I was reporting this story, I asked him just, off the cuff over dinner one night, like, how does anybody get into this field? Because it's a bit unusual. And he, was telling me his story, but he mentioned, he was like, this whole field traces back to this peculiar little woman at the Smithsonian who is no longer alive, but her name was Roxie Laybourne and she was incredible. And so I kind of, jotted that name down, started poking around. I recognized that the Smithsonian had some rich archives on Roxy, including an oral history with her. But then, like life gets in the way and I keep reporting different stories. And then a few years later, Audubon magazine sent me to the Everglades and to South Florida to report on invasive reptiles, including the Burmese python, which are those giant snakes. These invasive reptiles are eating a lot of birds. And turns out it's really hard to identify a bird that's been sitting in a snake's gut for, 2 or 3 weeks.
Mm.
And so while I was reporting that story, somebody said to me, or I asked, I was like, how do you know what bird that is? And they're like, oh, well, we often ship these up to the Smithsonian's Feather ID lab. And in my, everything started clicking in my head. And so I put in a call to the Smithsonian Feather ID lab, and I met a woman named Carla Dove who does all, who runs the lab now. And that's when, I'm talking to her and I'm interviewing her for this reptile piece. And she says, where are you? I said, I'm in Boston. She said, oh, my mentor, Roxie Laybourne, the first case she ever worked was an airplane crash in Boston. And at that point, I was just like, it felt very serendipitous and everything started falling into place. And that led to a magazine story about Roxie, which ultimately inspired the book.
And how did you go about putting the book together?
Slowly. I had written this magazine story, and part of the reason I was able to do the magazine story, and a big part of the reason I was able to do the book, is because before Roxie passed away, she did an extensive series of oral history interviews with the Smithsonian's internal historian. And it covered from Roxie's earliest life in North Carolina all the way up to her she was almost 90 at that time, I believe, what she was doing then. So that oral history sort of gave me a roadmap with which to work. And so that was the first piece of the puzzle. I felt really confident because I was fortunate to have Roxie talking for hours. I had,
Mm.
just so much material. But then I got into the archives down in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And that's when I realized, there's a book to be written because I'm not going to, it wasn't a room full of material, but it was many boxes filled with casework, documents, legal transcripts, all types of interesting historical artifacts of her life. And I just spent a lot of time in that room scanning all these documents. And then from there, I was also able just to track down a lot of people who crossed paths with Roxie during her life, whether they were attorneys that she worked with on cases that they were prosecuting and she testified on their behalf. Her proteges, I found several, including a retired FBI agent, including the woman Carla Dove, who runs the Smithsonian's lab. So I was so fortunate that there were so many people still around who had very clear, crisp memories of their interactions with Roxie. And then it just became a matter of, okay, how do I distill all this information and piece it into a narrative?
Mhm. Continuing, would you share a little bit more what is entailed with forensic ornithology and what were some of Roxy's revolutionary contributions to the field?
Yeah, so the basis of forensic ornithology really lies in the ability to take a tiny bit of feather and figure out what species of bird it came from. And so this is what Roxie would study. This isn't a feather. This is a tiny, tiny part of a feather. And
Mhm.
this is what we're looking at there. These are called the barbules. So if you think about a feather, it kind of branches off and branches off again. And so Roxie figured out that if you look at the microstructures of these feathers, these barbules, they're quite different among bird families. So, a crow is going to look a lot different from a pigeon. And right now we're looking at a mourning dove. And
Mm.
so Roxy figured out these little nodules that you see, they're, differently spaced out on certain types of birds, even among different types of pigeons, they'll look different. So she was often able to get down to the species level identification based on
Mm.
the microstructures. And it's just incredible, but she wouldn't have been able to figure this out if she didn't have access to the Smithsonian's vast research collection and all the specimens there. And so the Smithsonian, I want to say, has something like 650,000 research bird specimens in its collection, covering, oh, I don't know, 90 or 95% of known species of birds.
Mm.
So she had this, she would get the unknown feather samples from either a crime scene or an aviation disaster. And then she would go wander through the Smithsonian collection and say, maybe this is a crow, or maybe this is a
Hmm.
tail hawk. And she had the ability to compare, a known specimen with an unknown. And over many, many years and tens of thousands of identifications, she was able to determine, the differences in these microstructures among birds.
Yeah, fascinating. You made reference to the Eastern Airlines crash in Boston, and that turned out to be such a turning point, I think, in Roxy's career. For those not familiar with it, could you walk us through that a little bit as a prime example of her work?
Sure. Yeah. So, Roxy started her career as a taxidermist and spent much of her life in the 1930s and 1940s doing taxidermy, mostly in North Carolina. And then she gets called up to Smithsonian to start as a taxidermist. It's World War II. A lot of the men that were working at the Smithsonian had to go fight, went overseas. Smithsonian's research collection was really falling into disrepair. There weren't the hands to keep it going. So Roxy came in as a taxidermist, stayed and worked in taxidermy. Then eventually, switches roles a little bit, starts working for Fish and Wildlife, still within the Smithsonian, but managing the research collection. So kind of, I don't want to say dull, but like routine ornithological work, managing a collection, shipping out birds to other researchers, just managing the collection. So she wasn't doing forensic ornithology. Then in 1960, an airplane taking off from Logan International, an Eastern Airlines flight, takes off, hits a flock of birds right near the end of the runway, and goes into Boston Harbor, loses power in most of its engines, and crashes into Boston Harbor and kills 62 people. And it
Yeah.
is just a massive tragedy. I still can't imagine what the family of those victims. No one at that time, and no one today really thinks about an airplane crashing from birds. And so the FAA was, in its infancy at that point, and everyone's kind of like, aviation insiders knew that birds were a problem.
Mm.
The Wright brothers struck a bird on one of their first flights. You can go back into history during World War II. U.S. Air Force or the military was thinking about this a bit. They were having a lot of problems with birds in the Pacific, but no one really thought a bird could take down a commercial airliner. And so the FAA, as they start examining this wreck in Boston, they pull the plane out, they get witness reports saying, we think it hit birds. And they're like, we need to know what type of birds this hit. This is new to us. How do we do this? And ultimately what happened was they shipped it down. They took some of the bird remains out of the engines. I don't know what those remains looked like, but I can't imagine they were pretty, and they certainly weren't in one piece. And they shipped it to Roxy and her boss or they actually shipped it to Roxy's boss at the time and said, "Can you help us?" And the boss was like, "I think I know just the woman who might be able to handle this type of work." And sure enough, Roxy sat down and sifted through those first, batch of bird remains, and she was able to determine it was European starlings, which are a very abundant bird in this area. And that, people were like, huh, we might need to start studying bird strikes a bit more. And, 1962, just as that actually, airplane crash investigations take a long time. So that investigation wrapped up maybe 18 months after the actual crash, the report came out. And then a few months later, an airplane flying over Maryland crashes. Turns out a bunch of swans hit that bird. So airplane, a completely different type of bird. It was in fall migration. So, there's a lot of birds moving around at that time, including swans over the Chesapeake Bay, which is a real popular area for them. And that's where they realized, like, wow, this is two fatal civilian airplane crashes in a matter of 2 years. We need to have a system to start identifying birds that are getting struck by airplanes and figure out how to deal with this. And that's kind of how Roxy got pulled into this world. And at that time, it was really just focused on aviation. But as the book goes into, it spawned into, Roxy's FBI got word, Fish and Wildlife got word. Everyone was like, we might actually be able to do something with feather forensics that extends beyond airline crashes.
With aviation in mind, what type of safety standards, both with the FAA, even NASA, and even the constructing of planes came about from Roxy's initial efforts.
Yeah, so I think with the airplane crash here in 1960 in Boston, it kind of got waved off at first as a freak accident. Sure, it was birds, but and there's even a report that says like under all you could replicate these circumstances 100 times and the airplane won't crash. So people kind of waved it off as like maybe we should understand what's going on, but I don't think we need to start tweaking airline safety standards. Then this airplane crash over Maryland in 1962. The swans hit the rear of the plane, punched a hole through essentially the rear tail of the plane, the rear stabilizer. And that was like, wow, we need to reassess our engineering standards. And we might need to, have actual clarification on the weight of bird requirements, um, how thick a windshield needs to be, or what weight of a bird a windshield needs to be able to withstand
Mm.
impact from. And I found this great letter in Roxy's archives. It was toward the end of her life that a contemporary high up ranking official in the US Air Force just wrote her a letter of gratitude, essentially. And he said that, looking back at her work, without Roxy's contributions, without the bird identifications and understanding the species and weight that were getting hit, the technical community was left solving a problem it could not define. So
Mm.
it's like all these engineers, like bird proof your airplanes. Well, how much does the bird weigh? What birds are getting hit? Are they flocking or is it individuals? And that's where Roxy's research really helps because she identified tens of thousands of these airplane struck birds. Airplanes and birds hit every day. Very rarely do they cause an accident. And I should make that clear. This is very rare that an airplane crashes because of a bird strike. But Roxy was able to look at all the evidence of, and figure out what birds were not causing airplane crashes. And that really helped the technical community understand the parameters in which they needed to design airplanes to be able to withstand bird strikes.
In addition to aviation, you mentioned that her research went into a variety of other fields. Could you share a brief example from a criminal investigation that she was called into?
One of the first criminal investigations she worked, and this was not well known, in the late 60s, early 70s, some white supremacists, including a former high ranking member of the KKK, essentially kidnapped and tarred and feathered a civil rights activist in Michigan. And they left this poor guy slathered in feathers and tar, and essentially were about to get away with it.
Mhm.
And during the course of the investigation, the local police and I think maybe even the federal agents got involved, and they found, some feather fragments in the drying machine lint trap of one of the suspects. They found feather fragments stuck to one of the boots of one of the suspects and in the pickup truck bed. And they even took some of these suspects' pillows from their home and had Roxy compare the feathers taken off the poor civil rights guy who was tarred and feathered with the feathers from the pillows, the feathers from the lint trap. And that was key to this case. She didn't testify in that case, but there's newspaper clippings showing that the investigation was stalled because they couldn't figure out how to show that the feathers pulled off this poor man were the same as the feathers found on the suspects. Roxy could show that, and she did. And the feds got their prosecution. So that was one of the first cases. And then there were murders that followed and all types of calamities and tragedies and just horrible stuff that she investigated that you never think of bird feathers showing up at a crime scene, but detectives find all types.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. In what ways did Roxy challenge the norms of her time, both in the sciences and society at large?
I think in the sciences, something that I love about Roxy, she didn't have a PhD. She was in a world, the Smithsonian is, we think of the Smithsonian, most of us, including myself until this point, we hear Smithsonian, we think museums, we think going down to Washington, D.C. and walking through all the Smithsonian museums. There is an entire universe, research universe. Smithsonian is home to some of the smartest, brightest biological researchers, scientific researchers. And there's a lot of PhDs there, and it's academic in the sense that, you rise through the ranks based on your academic credentials. Roxie didn't have a PhD. She aspired to get one. She was contemplating one. She had earned her master's degree. She was thinking about going to get her PhD, and then she ended up pregnant, and was like, that might be a lot to juggle. So she kind of shelved her PhD aspirations, but she accomplished all this innovation and this new way of thinking about feather fragments without being, the PhD, but she certainly knew more about feathers than a lot of PhD holding ornithologists and biologists. So I think that's one way I really just, she was challenging the norm of scientific research in that sense and doing applied research compared to some of the more esoteric research that we see out of academia that, has its value, but it isn't so easily applied to the real world like Roxie's work was. In terms of societal norms, she was a woman in the Smithsonian in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that was not an easy environment.
Yeah.
And she just had so much grit and such perseverance. There were certainly allies, there were certainly men who supported her, and there were a lot of men who just waved her off as, this isn't real science. There was an anecdote that when she first arrived at the Smithsonian, she was doing taxidermy work, and all the guys had, all the male taxidermists had these big taxidermy tables because you're working with some big specimens. Mm-hmm. They gave Roxie, Roxie was a small woman. They gave her this tiny little card table, and she was like, it's not the size of the taxidermist, it's the size of the animal that the table's for. And I just find that to be such a telling anecdote about how people thought about kind of women in science at that time. And she just got through it and did her job.
So building on that, what lessons do you think young scientists and maybe even especially women in STEM can take from Roxie's life?
So this is something that people came to, particularly a lot of women researchers later in Roxie's life kind of came to her seeking advice. And I found some letters in her archives, and I've talked to some of her proteges that are women. I found some letters in our archives from women that were going into the sciences and looking for advice about being a woman in science. And Roxie's point of view was always, don't think about it. Do the work. Just work harder than everyone. And she was in the lab 6 or 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. She would take work home with her. I think even maybe some of her relationships suffered because of her work ethic. She was just laser focused on work. But that is what she always told her mentees, like, don't get distracted by the gender dynamics. Don't get distracted by all the noise around you. Focus on the job at hand. Do it better than anyone can do it. And you don't have to worry about being a woman in that case because no one else is going to be able to do what you can. And I find that to be somewhat amazing. And I'm also, I don't know how it goes over with everyone because I think she was almost blind to some of the inequities because she just worked all the time. Some people may not find that to be the most helpful advice, and maybe it's a little bit myopic in terms of the real systemic challenges and sexism at these institutions. But Roxie was like, I have feathers to identify. That's my job. That's what I'm doing.
Speaking of feathers, have this wonderful image that appears on the cover of the book. Can you share a little bit about where Roxie is and what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so this is just a gorgeous photo, and I'm so happy that the Smithsonian made this photo because what we're looking at is one hallway of the Smithsonian's bird collection, the Division of Birds collection.
Oh,
there are many hallways. As I mentioned, about 650,000 specimens, I believe. So this is just a slice of the birds. These are the reference specimens, though. So this is, if somebody was poaching scarlet macaws, Roxie had the ability to take a scarlet macaw, take a little tiny bit of feather fragment off of it, and use that as a known comparative specimen. And so this is Roxie later in life, just looking awesome, surrounded by so many birds. It's just a gorgeous photo, but it gives you, I think it helps really give people a sense of scale about how big the Smithsonian's research collection is and how important it is.
Incredible, incredible. Coming to the end, what's been some of the initial reaction and feedback you've received from the book?
People are amazed. I think people are just generally, everyone, including my friends, I tell them that I've written a book and they say, "What's your book about?" And I say, I like to lead with the boring. I'm like, I've written a book about a scientist who developed ways of identifying birds based on the feather microstructures. And at that point, you can see people's eyes glaze over and they're like, "Why would you write a book on this?" And then I say, and she used those methods to solve murders and airplane crashes. And so people are just fascinated. I think especially since the pandemic, but even before that, birds have always held a special place in a lot of people's hearts and minds. A lot of people discovered birding during the pandemic and it stayed, and it's, understandable. I take my daughters out looking for birds all the time. So there's that connection to birds, and this is a totally different way of thinking about birds and how we interact with them, how society, or I should say, birds' place within our society. And it's just, I think people are finding a lot that they can relate to. And also, I hope this book reaches different audiences other than just birders, because I think it should reach the true crime readers and the aviation enthusiasts, because it's more of that than a birding book, I think. And what I'm hearing is just people, a recent very positive review came out, and the last line of it was something to the extent of, this book needs to be read to be believed. And it's true, because when you say, "Oh, well, she solved a murder that, of somebody getting suffocated with a pillow," it's like, how? But, there's a lot of almost disbelief around Roxie's work.
Well, I think in addition to her incredible story, what makes the book such a wonderful read and a must is your writing style and the way you're able to tell the story in such an engaging manner. So highly recommend it for sure. Eager to hear much more about the reaction in the coming weeks. In closing, Chris, what are some of your current or upcoming projects that you might be able to share?
At this point, I'm kind of just trying to catch my breath a little bit. I have a day job. I write a lot. I have two young daughters. I just want to, I've always wanted to write a book, right? This is, I think, a lot of journalist aspirations, or narrative journalist. And to work so hard on something for years, I've been thinking about Roxie in some form or fashion for almost 10 years. I've been working on it
Wow.
for about 4 years. It's just incredibly gratifying to see this getting out into the world and to see it being received so positively and see people forming connections with Roxie. So I just want to kind of savor the moment and really see Roxy's story take flight, and a new generation of people kind of learn about her remarkable work. It's just immensely gratifying, and I feel so privileged to have been like in the Smithsonian archives going through her paperwork. I'm like still pinching myself that I was given this opportunity.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end. I want to thank you again, congratulate you again. Look forward to upcoming work once you get revved up again, and continued success with all future endeavors, Chris.
Thank you so much, Jay. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.